So daf for today's daf Yud, and we take a look at the last line in daf Tes Amud Beis. Hahu shtara, there was a star that Havi Kosevle, and it was written on it Shis Shnin Yiserosa, which means that it would seem that this star is what's called post-dated, meaning, let's say, instead of writing the number 500 in what's called minyan stars, it said 506. So the Matmos took place really in the year 500, but it wasn't dated until 6 years later. And Sovar Rabbana Kami de Rava Lemema, the students at the presence of Rava thought to say that Hai Shtar Ma'ucharhu. This is a Shtar Ma'uchar, otherwise known as a post-dated document. Now, what's the status of Shtar Ma'uchar? Keep in mind, it's not a Shtar Posel. Shtar Ma'uchar is kosher, just that we're worried about the Lekuchos, meaning those who purchased properties from the Loveh, and the question is whether there was a shibud on it. Well, those Lekuchos cannot be responsible from the date of the Matmos if it was post-dated. They can only be responsible if they bought the karka after the year 506, because the, so to speak, public announcement about this lien, Lien, on this shibud is 506. So therefore, what the Talmidim were suggesting was the akve ad mata zimne v'lo tarif. The malve, if he wants to collect from the lien on the karkos that was sold by the lover to the lekuchos, he can't do so until that 6-year period passes. However, Omar Rav Nachman says, you know what? I'm going to explain to you why there's a funny kind of situation here of a post-dated shtar. Why would a malve want to accept a shtar from the lover that's post-dated? He's like shooting himself in the leg because he won't be able to collect from the kuchas until that later date. Therefore, we have to do everything that we can logically to figure out how we can calculate that the shtar was valid from the year 500, 6 years earlier than what's written in the shtar. How can we do such a thing? Hi Safra Davkana Kasve. Okay, so we're talking about a sofer, and the sofer writes the date in the shtar in a very precise way, and he's operating with what's called minyan shtaros. Now, minyan shtaros means that we calculate the year based on the Yavanim, based on the Greek kingdom. And I could understand why the Sofer wrote the number 506, adding 6 years, because the Greeks, although they defeated the Persians 6 years earlier, but nevertheless for that 6-year period, they ruled in a place called Elam. And they hadn't yet established their kingship over the entire area of the land of Israel. Danan lo chashvina lahu, although we would calculate those 6 years and include them, because again, the Greeks were Lamaisa, in dominion, they had supremacy. But who, meaning the scribe himself, who's very precise, kachoshev lahu, he takes in consideration that 6-year gap in which the Greeks were not really fully in control. They were in Elam, but that's the extent of their political rulership. Ubizmani kasve, but really, the shtar was written on the date of 500, meaning the sofer in year 500 wrote the shtar because he was commissioned to do so by the Lov, and that was the moment that the Matmos was given from the Lov to the Malva. The reason why he added 6 years is because the Greeks were not yet in fully control. But we can verify or validate, I should say, that shtar from the year 500. Desanyan, I'll bring you a brisa to prove it. Rabbi Yossi Omer Sheishana Molchu B'Elam. The Greeks ruled for a period of 6 years over Elam, right? Over Elam, but not over the entire area. When did they finally establish their rule to encompass the entire world? That was only after the 6-year period that they were in Elam. So it comes out that both Rav Nachman and the Talmidim of Rava agree that this star is kosher. The only major discrepancy between the two is that, according to the Talmidim of Rava, the Lekuchos would only be responsible, and the Malva only has rights to collect and confiscate the properties of the Lekuchos as a lien on the karka of the Lova. That would only be after the 6-year period in the year 506, whereas, according to Rav Nachman, already now, we don't have to wait till 506. Already now, immediately when the clock strikes 500, the lekuchos are responsible, and the lien is chal on their karka, and therefore the malva could collect the properties that were sold. Maskif lo Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Wait a minute. Rav Yaakov says everybody here is working with the same premise, namely that we calculate years based on the control of Malchus Yavan. Mimai, how do we know the Malchus Yavanina, that we count according to the Greek rulership over the earth? Dilmol Yitzias Mitzrayim Anina. Maybe we should calculate based on Yitzias Mitzrayim. Calculate the years since we had the redemption from Egypt. V'shavke l'alfa kama, and the scribe decided to leave out, omit, and disregard the first 1,000 years of post Yitzias Mitzrayim. V'nakte alpha basra v'haima ucharu. So therefore, he only takes into consideration the last 1,000 years, and therefore the star is indeed a star ma'ucha. Why? Because let's understand that Yitzias Mitzrayim took place exactly 1,000 years before the Greek occupation over the world. And therefore, it's quite possible that the dates that were used for this, or for that matter, by any other sofer, are based not on the Greeks at all, but maybe the dates are based on the Yitzias Mitzrayim. Why did the scribes ignore the first millennium, meaning post Yitzias Mitzrayim, that first 1,000 years? That was just for simplicity's sake. But the dates that were used by the Sofrim, although they're based on Yitzias Mitzrayim, come out to be identical to the years of the Greek era. Now, how is that so? So the period between Yitzias Mitzrayim and the Greek era can be calculated in the following way. The first Beis HaMikdash was built 480 years after Yitzias Mitzrayim, and it stood for 410 years. So if we add 480 to 410, we're already up to 910. Then there was a 7-year period of Golus Bavel until the second Bais was built. The second Bais would last for 420 years. And now, if we add this all up together, adding the 480 together with the 70 and the 420, we end up with 1380, which would mean that the Yitzias Mitzrayim took place 1,380 years before the destruction, the Churban of Bayis Sheni. Now, the Greek era, this we discussed at great length in the previous daf, began 380 years before Churban Abayis. So the Exodus took place 1,000 years before the Greek era. Okay then? Maskif lo, yeah, right. Rav Nachman rejects this argument that the calculation is based on Yitzias Mitzrayim, and therefore you end up with the year 506 with that 6-year discrepancy. He says, the facts on the ground are that in Chutz La'aretz, and this was a star outside of the land of Israel, then we follow the calculation and the counting of the years based on the Greek kings. Now, the count in the Gola in Chutz La'aretz, it's based on the Greek ascension to power. It's quite possible that the Sofer on this note, the one who wrote this particular Shtar Milva, began his count 6 years earlier, when the Greeks had not yet conquered the world, but they were only ruling over Elam. So therefore, we have to assume that this was the case in this Shtar, and therefore we are able to avoid the unlikely possibility that the Malva agreed to take a post-dated Shtar. Now, the Gemara back on Daf Tes had already established, based on the Bryce of Seder Olam, that the Persian kingdom ruled during the Second Temple era, and from that point on, count how many years there are after the destruction of the temple. But in the diaspora, we write documents according to the Greek era, and the practice of dating documents by the Greek era was limited to the diaspora, in contrast to the residents of Israel, who counted the years that followed the destruction. So therefore, Rav Nachman establishes that Ein Monim El Malchei, in Chutzlatz we only count according to the Greek kings. And who Sovar, Rav Acha bar Yaakov thought that the Chuye Komadchile, that this answer of Rav Nachman is only just it's like he's pushing him off, and that's it. Nafak Dak Ve'ashkach, but when he went out and he investigated, he found that the Rav Nachman was right based on a brisa, and the brisa says, "Bagola ein monim elo malchei yovim bilvanim." That in the diaspora we only count the years from the era of the Greek kings. Omar Avinu Masnisa Nami Daika, and I can prove this to you from a diuk in the Lashon HaMishnah, the Snan we learned in the Mishnah. Now this is a sugya of Rosh Hashanah, right? There are 4 Rosh Hashanah, and one of them is Rosh Hashanah L'Malachim for the kings, and the Gemara says over there that's relevant to Shtaros. Echad ben Nisan Rosh Chodesh L'Malachim. On the 1st of Nisan is the day of Rosh Chodesh for kings, Ula Regalim and for the Regalim, and this is relevant to what's called Bal Tiacher Korbono, meaning if somebody takes a vow to bring an offering or to make a donation, then he violates Bal Tiacher if 3 Aliyos the regular have passed since he made his commitment to pay. And therefore, when we calculate the new year for Regalim, for festivals, in order to get those 3 festivals, and if he hasn't fulfilled his vow until that point, then he violates Bal Tiacher, we start with Echad ben Nisan. V'amrinon, and we ask the Malachim, L'mai Hilchasa, so when we write a shtar and we want to date the shtar, because the shtar is possible without a date, we use the date based on the calendar of the kings, meaning that the new year starts as the Shana L'Malachim for Shtaros, and that's on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Utnan, where we're still in the middle of Ravina. Ravina says, we learned in that Mishnah that B'yecha b'Tishra Shana L'Shanin. There's another Rosh Hashanah, another system, and the first day of Rosh Hashanah of the new year is Aleph Tishrei. And that's as far as Shanim are concerned. We'll see exactly what that means. We'll Shemitah. For example, you want to calculate whether or not, we started a new year of Shemitah. It all depends on Aleph Tishrei. V'amrinon, and we ask the question, L'shanim, L'mai Hilchasa. Well, what are you telling me that the new year for reckoning the years is on the 1st of Tishrei, or Rav Nachman l'shtaros, in order to know how to calculate the date of the shtar? Now here we have a kasha shtaros adodi. We have 2 parts of the Mishnah regarding shtaros that contradict one or the other, because at the beginning it says that the Rosh Hashanah, the new year for shtaros, is Nisan, and yet in the second set, it's in the second part of the Mishnah, it sets the calculation for documents as Aleph Tishrei. Ubishaninon, and how do we resolve this contradiction? Kan l'malchi so kan l'malchi ovdei kochavim. Right, in the first clause, the reference is to Malchei Yisrael. And as far as Malchei Yisrael is concerned, the Rosh Hashanah is Aleph Nisan. But Kan, regarding the second clause, which we said is totally an Aleph Tishrei, that's l'malchei ovdei kochavim. Because they start the counting in Tishrei. However, for the kings of Israel, we count, how many years is it since the king was appointed, and we go by the Aleph Nisan. Oh, now we get back to Ravina's proof after this whole circular stuff. Anan hashta Tishrei manina. In our times, we count the years from Tishrei. And as we said before, Malchei Ovdei Kochavim, the idolatrous kings of those nations, they calculate from Aleph Tishrei. Now, what that means is that our count nowadays is based on the Greek era. When did the Greeks take over? Why do we count from Tishrei? We should be counting from Nisan. So we see that we calculate the years from the era of the Greek kings, and that's going to support the opinion that we mentioned before in the name of Rav Nach. Okay, now we start a new sugya. Yom Ginusya Shel Malcheim. Okay, so there's a day called Ginusya, and that's when the idol worshippers celebrate. And we can't go into business transactions with them before their celebration. Mai v'Yom Ginusya Shel Malcheim, Am Rabbi Yehuda, Yom Shamim Midbo of the Godmas Malchim. So when the Goyim and the idol worshippers appoint and inaugurate the king, that's called Yom Ginusya. And that's when they celebrate in their idolatrous temples. For Tanya, the Gemara asks a question. We have another brayso that says Yom Ginusya v'Yom Shammai Midbo as Malchim. You see it 2 separate days. There's one day called Ginusya, and there's another day of the initiation or the inauguration of the king itself. Lo kasha, hadidi hadibre. In other words, it seems when the son of a king, the prince will call him, gets engaged or married, then his father, the king, will celebrate that day. So Hadi Day, when it says Ginusya Day, it's referring to the day in which the king was inaugurated to sit on the throne. It says the day on which they inaugurate the king, that's referring to the son's succession. When the king arranges for his son to ascend the throne in his lifetime so that the son will secure his place in the office, the father rejoices and declares a day of festival. Umi Muki Malka Bar Malka, you're assuming that the Romans will allow for the next in line, the next in kin, the prince, the son of the king, to inherit the rulership. That's not so. But Tony Rav Yosef, Hine Katon Nisaticha Bagoyim. At the beginning of Sefer of Avoda is not a long Sefer. Anyway, it says over there, behold, I have made you inferior amongst the nations. She'ein Moshiva Melech ben Melech. It would seem that the Jewish people, this pasuk is referring to the Romans, that you are considered inferior amongst the nations because you don't appoint the son of the king as the king. We are more hesitant to allow the king to appoint his son as king. And then the pasuk says, Bozu yatoma od, you're very despised. Shein lo ksav lo lashon. They don't have their own language. Apparently, it's the Roman language is a some sort of reformulation of another country's language, maybe German, I don't know, I don't know what language. And they don't have their own writings. In any event, Genusia cannot refer to the ascension of the emperor when he's inaugurated. So what is Genusia then? Elamai Yom Genusia, Yom Haleda. It's the emperor's birthday. We'll see about the anniversary of his death. But Sanya Yom Genusia Yom Leda, it says at 2 separate days. There's one called Genusia, there's another called the anniversary of the birth of the king. Happy birthday. Lo Kasha. Hadi day, Hadibre. When we use the term in the price of the Genusia day, that's the emperor's birthday. Everybody's excited about the emperor's birthday. But Hadibre, the other term means his son's birthday. So the Gemara says, Vasanya, we have a brisa that says Yom Genusa Shalo, Yom Genusa Shal B'no. Yom Aleda Shalo, Yom Aleda Shal B'no. And we see that Genusia is referring not just to the emperor's birthday, but even to the day of his son's birthday. Elamai Yom Genusa, Gemara's conclusion is Yom Shamamidim Bo Malcolm. It's the day on which they inaugurate the king. Below Kasha. And there's no kasha from the price that says Genusia day and the day that they inaugurate the king, which sounds like it's two separate days. Hadi day, Hadibre. The Genusia day refers to the ascension of the emperor to his position. Hadibre, on the other hand, will celebrate the son's ascension to his commitment. Lo Mukme Malka Bar Malka Ad Yehei Al Yidei She'ela Mukme. And if you'll ask the Kasha, they don't appoint the son of the king as king, as we saw before, that wasn't accepted. We'll resolve this by saying Al Yidei She'ela Mukme, that if the emperor requests that his son should be appointed, we'll accept it. Kigon, and this actually happened. Asverus ben Antinotus. Asverus, we'll soon see who he was. He was obviously the son of Antinotus, but he goes beyond that. And he will rule, filling in his father's, shoes, so to speak. He'll slip into his father's shoes, because his father requested that he should be appointed as king. Omle Antinotus the Rebbe. Okay, so from this point and on, for the balance of our daf, we're going to learn about the special relationship between Antinonus, who was the emperor of Rome, and he's called Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, ruled from 161 to 180 CE. In the course of his travels through the empire, he visited Judea, where he met Rabbeinu HaKadosh, with whom he formed a lifelong friendship. So Antinonus turns to Rebbe, he says, Be'inu limlochav as virus bri tochati. Tochati means in my place, mitachtai. I want my son, Antoninus, to be appointed as king and fill in after I die. It is avid Teveria Kolonaya. He could be doing wonders for Teveria, meaning a lot of Jews lived in Teveria, and at that time they had to pay heavy taxes, and Antoninus felt that his son, if he became king, would free the Jewish community of paying those heavy taxes. Right, there's another request that I want to put forward, that my son should be the king. I can't ask for two requests. They won't grant me two requests. So Rebbe responds and he says, I say Gavra, bring me a man. Now, Rebbe would never communicate with Atinonis explicitly. It wasn't like he called him up on a phone. No, none of that. That wouldn't go for security purposes. But rather, what Rebbe would do is he would answer with like a kind of a riddle. Like in this case, he says, had him ride upon the shoulders of his fellows, he put a dove in the hands of the upper one. I want you to announce me that that the upper one I guess the upper one is the one that was piggybacked on top of the shoulders of his fellow. He's called the Ov one, and he's holding on to a dove. So again, the upper one is carrying a dove. It's very interesting how Rebbe is sending like riddles to Antinonis. He's sending him a riddle because he's telling the lower guy to tell the upper guy to let the dove fly from his hand. Right. So on the first round, he put the dove in the hand of the upper one. And now he's telling the lower one to notify the upper one that he should fly the dove. Antonina said, Shema Mina, I'm going to reinterpret and decipher this cryptic message of Rebbe. Hachikam, this is what he really means to say me. At be'e minayu das virus bre. Right, you're saying to me, should I ask the Senate, in Rome, to let as virus, my son, rule after me? Las virus Tveria Kalana. Tell us virus to declare Tiberius a free community, meaning free from taxes. Amalahu, Antonius says to Rabbi Yehuda, Nasi Mitzarin Ali, Shuvi Ramoy, the dignitaries of Rome persecuting me. So Rebbe responds, he says, Ma'aya Leili Gino. He brought Antoninus into a garden. Kol Yom Akale Pugla Mi Mishrad Kameh. Each day would pluck a single radish from its bed in front of Antoninus. Omar, and he said to himself, Shema Mina Hachikam. This is what they were advising me to do. At Ktol Chad Minayu, Delotis Garabahu Bekul. So Rebbe's cryptic message is being interpreted as saying, kill them off one at a time. Why? Because every day he uprooted a single radish from its bed. So therefore the every day means chad binayu, kill them off one by one. And now we turn to Daf Yud Amud Beis.